the Old Testament is absolutely critical for us today, and really it's been the influence of what was once called Marcionism that has led some Christians to think that the Old Testament is either secondary, unimportant, or worse still, non-relevant at all to the modern Christian. Marcion was a heretic who was concerned to deny the validity of the Old Testament and actually significant portions of the New Testament. It's important to remember that the Bible of the early church, of Jesus and of the apostles, was the Old Testament. When Jesus talks about the scriptures and says it is written during the temptation and cites Deuteronomy, when he's talking about have you not read to the Pharisees and scribes, he's talking about the Old Testament. When Paul says to Timothy all scripture is God-breathed, he's talking about at that point what we call the Old Testament. So clearly, the Old Testament is absolutely central to the life of the Christian. Second of all, I think it's very important to remember that Jesus himself affirmed the significance, the abiding validity of the totality of God's law, of the Older Testament. In Matthew 5:17 through 20, he says essentially that not a single punctuation mark is going to fall from the law, or is going to be set aside till heaven and earth pass away. Now that's a fairly significant supporting statement for the abiding validity of the Older Testament, of God's law. So many people, when they ask about the relevance of the Old Testament, they're often not asking whether the Psalms are still valid, or whether Genesis or the Book of Kings are still important historically. They usually are wondering whether the law of Moses still applies, and Jesus makes clear that it is abiding, that it continues. I think a third thing that we must be reminded of is that the New Testament is clear in Hebrews 8 that the new covenant, or the newer covenant, which is ratified in the blood of Christ, is that the law of God is going to be written into the hearts of people. So, citing Jeremiah 31, the new covenant, according to Hebrews 8, is that the law is written into our hearts. It's inscribed into our hearts as Christians. So far from the law being, set aside or in some way undermined or abrogated, in fact, the contrary is true. That whole law is inscribed into the heart of the believer. And that makes a great deal of sense of the gospel, because the Apostle Paul says to Titus that we are being redeemed from all lawlessness. That's the nature of our redemption. It's from lawlessness, not so that we might be lawless and practice unrighteousness, but rather that the righteousness of the law might be fulfilled in us, so that we be conformed to the image of his Son, Paul says, to Christ, who was the one who kept the law perfectly. So any sort of idea that the gospel is about freeing us from God's righteous moral requirements is a misunderstanding of the gospel. When we think about the gospel and we talk about covenant and the new covenant, we must remember that covenant involved two things: oath or promise, and blood. Always in Scripture, oath or a promise and blood. Now, when the greater, which is God, makes a covenant with the lesser, with human beings, that covenant is already an act of grace. So when God made covenant with Noah, when he made covenant with Abraham, when he made covenant with the people of Israel and gave his law, these were all acts of grace. The giving of God's law is therefore an act of grace. Now, Christ goes up onto the mountain, interprets the law, and so doesn't give a new law, but corrects misinterpretations of the law, and then ratifies the new covenant in his blood at the Passover. And so we see both promise or oath and blood, law and blood, are involved in the making of every covenant. Oath or promise, blood, and sanction or law come together. And that's there throughout the New Testament.